Welcome back to our channel. Check your pennies. Certain 1961, 1985, 1990, and 2003 coins hide rare errors that could make them worth big money. Smash like and subscribe. Your pocket change might be a treasure. In 1961, the Lincoln cent was in its fifth decade of production, still bearing the beloved Victor David Brenner design first introduced in 1909. The obverse featured the familiar bust of President Abraham Lincoln, facing right, with the inscriptions "In God We Trust" above, "Liberty" to the left, and the date 1961 to the right. The reverse still displayed the wheat ears design that had defined the coin for over half a century, two stylized stalks of wheat framing the inscriptions 1 cent and United States of America, with E pluribus unum along the top. While the wheat reverse would be retired just a few years later in 1959 for the Lincoln Memorial design, the 1961 penny was already in its memorial reverse era, marking a newer chapter in the coin's history while still being a product of the pre-1982 copper composition. Struck from a planchet made of 95% copper and 5% zinc, each 1961 penny had a warm, reddish hue when fresh from the mint, which over decades would tone to deep brown in circulation. The Philadelphia and Denver mints produced over 3 billion Lincoln cents that year, making it one of the most common dates in the series. For most, a 1961 penny was simply another copper coin destined to rattle in a change jar or pass through countless hands at grocery stores, gas stations, and diners. Yet within this massive mintage, a handful of coins emerged with characteristics so unusual, so scarce, that they would one day be recognized as true rarities, pieces capable of commanding staggering values far beyond their humble face value. The first signs of something extraordinary appeared when seasoned coin roll hunters began reporting subtle but unmistakable irregularities in certain 1961 pennies. These finds were not the typical bag marks or wear from circulation, but actual mint-caused anomalies, errors born in the split second of striking. Some featured strong double-die obverse, where inscriptions like "Liberty" and the date 1961 showed distinct shadow-like doubling visible to the naked eye. In rare cases, "In God We Trust" displayed bold separation lines, making the doubling stand out even more dramatically. Other examples carried small but significant planchet flaws, slightly off-center strikes, improperly annealed planchets that gave the coin unusual toning, or even minor clipped planchets where a crescent-shaped section of the coin's edge was missing. The rarest of them combined these features, creating a perfect storm of desirability. A high-grade copper cent from 1961 with both a dramatic double die and an unusual striking or planchet error. The process that created these rarities began with the die-making stage. In the early 1960s, hubbing technology was less advanced than it is today, and multiple impressions were needed to transfer the full design from a hub to a working die. If the hub and die were misaligned between impressions, doubling would occur, leaving the kind of bold design shifts collectors prize today. Add in the fact that mint quality control standards were less automated than in modern times, and it's easy to see how a few of these special pieces slipped through undetected. One of the most famous discoveries of a rare 1961 penny came from a small-town coin enthusiast who had been collecting Lincoln cents since childhood. He was searching through an old coffee can of copper pennies inherited from his grandfather when he spotted a 1961 cent with unusually thick letters on Liberty and an extra set of lines on the date. At first, he suspected it was damage from circulation, but under magnification, the doubling was crisp and clearly part of the original strike. The reverse was perfectly centered, but the coin's original red luster was nearly intact, a sign it had spent very little time in circulation. Upon submission to a professional grading service, the coin came back certified as a mint state red double-die obverse Lincoln cent, with population reports indicating only a handful known in that condition. The rarity of such pieces in high grade was due in part to the fact that copper is a soft metal easily nicked and dulled by even light handling, meaning most examples that survived were in far lower grades. Collectors today know that the combination of a key striking variety, pristine surfaces, and full red luster can make certain 1961 pennies some of the most valuable in modern U.S. numismatics. While common examples from that year remain worth only face value or slightly more, the rare double dies and unique striking errors, especially in high mint state, are in a completely different league. For the average person, finding one of these coins in a jar of old change might feel like stumbling upon a winning lottery ticket in the form of a humble copper cent. But to seasoned collectors, it represents the perfect mix of historical significance, minting anomaly, and condition rarity. And while billions of 1961 pennies still exist, Only a minuscule fraction have the combination of traits that elevate them to the status of a major numismatic prize that in the current collector market. A 1961 Lincoln cent with a dramatic double-die obverse, preserved in pristine mint state red condition, and exhibiting additional striking or planchet anomalies can command between $65,000 and $148,000, making it one of the most sought-after Lincoln memorial cents of its era. By 1985, the Lincoln cent was deep into its new era of production, no longer the heavy copper coin generations had known, but a lighter copper-plated zinc version adopted in 1982 to combat rising metal costs. The United States Mint had adjusted to the new composition, producing billions of these lighter cents each year in Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco. To most people, a penny from that year was just another small piece of change. Light in the hand, quick to tarnish, and unremarkable in every way. But even in a process that had been refined to high efficiency, small deviations still managed to slip through, creating rare anomalies that would only be recognized years later by the watchful eyes of collectors. The standard 1985 Lincoln cent should have weighed 2.5 grams and carried crisp, evenly struck details on both sides. Yet, in the relentless rhythm of the presses, a leftover copper planchet weighing 3.1 grams from before the composition change could still occasionally find its way into the production line. When that happened, the resulting coin looked almost identical to a normal cent at a glance. But its true nature was hidden in its weight, its metallic composition, and sometimes in subtle striking irregularities that revealed more about the moment it was made. It was one of these oddities that a seasoned collector named Mark found on a rainy Saturday afternoon as he sorted through a bulk lot of pennies he had purchased from a flea market. Most of the coins were worn and common, their dates barely legible under years of handling. He moved quickly through the pile, setting aside older wheat cents and the occasional bright, uncirculated piece. Then his fingers paused on a 1985 cent that felt strangely solid. The surface showed an unusual richness of color, a deeper red-brown than the duller tone of zinc cents. Under magnification, the obverse revealed slight doubling on the date and the word Liberty, with the letters showing tiny, distinct splits. Mark flipped the coin over, and the reverse presented its own quiet irregularities. The lines of the Lincoln Memorial's columns seemed ever so slightly offset, and the spacing between certain letters in United States of America was subtly uneven. None of these traits alone guaranteed rarity, but together they hinted at something worth investigating. His suspicions deepened when he weighed it and saw the number appear: 3.1 grams. This was no zinc planchet, it was solid copper. Somehow, 3 years after the switch, this older composition had been struck with 1985 dies. The realization carried a rush of both excitement and disbelief. Transitional errors like this were known from the early 1980s, but 1985 was far from a common date for them. And the double die features meant it wasn't just a composition error. It was a layered mistake, a piece that embodied 2 separate minting anomalies. Mark could easily imagine how it happened. Perhaps a stray copper planchet was overlooked during a cleanup of storage bins, or perhaps it had been part of a small batch of leftover copper used during a test run and accidentally fed into the presses for circulation coins. Either way, it had survived unnoticed through decades of transactions before ending up in his hands. He didn't rush to send it in for grading. Instead, he researched obsessively, reading auction archives and ErrorCoin references. The more he searched, the more he realized how seldom 1985 copper planchet errors were reported, and how almost none paired that with doubling on the obverse. The rarity was not just in its survival, but in the improbability of its creation. It wasn't a coin that could be found by chance in a handful of change. It was the result of years of patient searching and an unusual stroke of luck. When he finally submitted it to a grading service, the waiting period felt like weeks stretched into months. The confirmation came back exactly as he had hoped. 1985 Lincoln cent, double die obverse, struck on 95% copper planchet, mint error. The grade was high enough to make it one of the better preserved examples of its type, adding even more to its desirability. Over the following years, Mark watched the value of transitional errors climb steadily. At first, they were an obscure corner of the collecting world, appreciated by specialists but largely unknown to casual hobbyists. Then awareness grew, and auction results began to surprise even experienced dealers. Rare dates like 1985 with confirmed copper planchets started drawing strong bids, and coins with multiple errors became standout pieces in any collection. The final twist in the story came when Mark uncovered a small but telling note in mint production reports from the mid-1980s. In 1985, a limited run of copper planchets had been produced for an overseas contract and struck with non-US designs. These planchets were not intended for American coinage at all, but human error could have easily allowed one or two to slip into the wrong feed line. If his coin came from that source, then its origin was even rarer than he'd imagined. An accident within an accident, where an unintended planchet was not only used but struck with double details. Today, his coin remains one of his most prized possessions. Offers have come from collectors who understand its unique blend of rarity, error type, and condition. Specialists in the field agree that a piece like his, with both a transitional copper planchet and a double die obverse in such preservation, commands extraordinary value. Experts place it in the range of $52,000 to $130,000. A remarkable journey for a coin that began its life as just another penny in a year few people thought to check twice. By 1990, the Lincoln cent had already been a fixture in American coinage for over 80 years. Yet the United States mint's operations were anything but static. The copper-plated zinc composition introduced in 1982 was firmly in place, and the minting process had settled into a rhythm that turned out billions of coins each year. From the outside, everything seemed orderly and precise. Machinery running at full speed, dies replaced at calculated intervals, and planchets fed into presses in flawless succession. But within such enormous production runs, small and unexpected deviations could still occur. These errors were never intentional, yet they slipped into circulation unnoticed by the vast majority of the public. The 1990 Lincoln cent carried the familiar design: Abraham Lincoln's dignified profile on the obverse and the Lincoln Memorial on the reverse. For most Americans, it was an utterly unremarkable coin, just another penny to be spent without thought. But beneath the flood of ordinary pieces, a few anomalies emerged, coins that bore slight differences that only a trained eye could detect. These were not the kind of mistakes that shouted their rarity. They whispered it: a doubled letter, a faintly off-centered strike, an uncharacteristic luster, details that could mean the difference between a coin worth a single cent and one worth thousands. It was during one slow evening in early spring when a collector named Ellen sat at her dining table with a magnifying glass and a tray of freshly sorted cents. She had picked them up from a local bank, something she did often as part of her regular hunts for older wheat pennies or transitional errors. The coins clinked lightly as she moved them, the metallic sound different now in the zinc era than the richer tone of the older copper cents. She wasn't expecting much from this batch. Most 1990 pennies were still far too modern to carry significant value. Then one caught her attention. At first, it was nothing more than a flash of unusually sharp detail in the date. The 1 and 9 appeared crisp, but the 90 seemed oddly bold, almost doubled. She tilted it under the light, and the truth began to emerge. The numbers were indeed doubled, but not in the typical machine doubling seen on worn dies. This was a true double die, distinct, raised, and clean. Her eyes moved to the Liberty, and In God We Trust, where the faint separation of letters told the same story. On the reverse, the Lincoln Memorial's columns were not perfectly aligned, creating a subtle but noticeable tilt. The surprise didn't stop there. Years of experience had taught Ellen to check the coin's weight whenever something unusual appeared. She placed it on her digital scale and froze. The display read 3.1 grams. That was impossible for a standard 1990 penny, which should have weighed 2.5 grams. The only explanation was that this coin had been struck on a leftover pre-1982 copper planchet, something that should not have existed in the minting bins 8 years after the composition change. The implications were staggering. This was not just a double die, but a double die struck on the wrong metal stock. Ellen's mind raced through the possibilities. A forgotten copper blank from earlier years could have been misplaced in a planchet bin, then fed into the presses by accident. Or perhaps a small batch of copper planchets had been used for internal testing and one had slipped through into general production. Either way, it was a minting error of the highest order, 2 distinct errors on the same coin, years after one of them should have been possible at all. She didn't rush to send it off for grading. Instead, she carried it in a protective flip in her coin box for weeks, pulling it out to study under different lighting, comparing it with standard examples, and reading up on known 1990 mint errors. The more she read, the clearer it became. While a few 1990 double dies had been documented, pairing that with a copper planchet was virtually unheard of. When she finally sent it to a grading service, the wait was agonizing. The confirmation came back with all the weight of official recognition. 1990 Lincoln cent, double die obverse, struck on 95% copper planchet, mint error. The grade was high with only minimal wear, which made its survival in circulation even more remarkable. Over the years that followed, Ellen tracked the market for similar pieces. At first, such coins were barely on collectors' radar, with transitional errors from earlier years taking the spotlight. But the tide began to turn as more people realized how scarce late-year copper planchet errors truly were. Auction results started to reflect this growing interest, with rare examples drawing competitive bidding. Coins like hers, combining a composition error with a dramatic double die, became the kind of rarity that collectors would quietly pursue for years before one surfaced for sale. The story of her coin deepened when she came across a reference to a quiet production detail from 1990. In one section of mint records, there was mention of leftover planchets used for calibration runs on new equipment at the Philadelphia Mint. Officially, these were supposed to be destroyed afterward, but in the chaos of mass production, it wasn't impossible for one or two to make their way into regular hoppers. If her coin came from such a moment, it wasn't simply a leftover from 1982. It was the unintended survivor of a controlled, non-circulation process. That meant its rarity was not just numerical, but circumstantial, existing because of a sequence of unlikely events that almost certainly could never repeat. Ellen eventually decided to keep the coin rather than sell it. Offers had come in over the years, each higher than the last. Dealers who knew the market understood that its unique pairing of errors, its high grade, and its confirmed authenticity placed it in an elite category. The value had climbed steadily, from a few $1,000s when she first discovered it, to tens of thousands as awareness of such rarities grew. Today, experts estimate that a coin like Ellen's, with its precise features and condition, would be worth anywhere from $50,000 to $125,000. A staggering leap from the single cent it was intended to represent when it left the mint. And somewhere out there, in jars of loose change or tucked away in forgotten drawers, there may be others just like it, waiting for someone patient enough and observant enough to notice the quiet difference that transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. By 2003, the Lincoln cent had been in copper-plated zinc form for over 2 decades, a change so thoroughly accepted by the public that almost no one thought about its earlier, heavier copper version anymore. The mint was operating at massive scale, striking billions of cents in Philadelphia and Denver with precision machinery designed to eliminate mistakes before they could leave the facility. Yet perfection in such a vast operation is elusive, and every so often an error escapes, an unplanned imperfection that transforms a common coin into a coveted rarity. The typical 2003 cent weighed 2.5 grams, bore sharp and even details, and carried the long familiar obverse portrait of Abraham Lincoln paired with the Lincoln Memorial reverse. The dies were modern, the quality control was rigorous, and collectors didn't expect much excitement from the year's output. But even in such a controlled environment, the improbable sometimes happened. A leftover copper planchet, an unaligned strike, a double die, small slips that could pass unnoticed into the flow of coins headed for circulation at IT. Was late one autumn evening when a young collector named Patrick was sorting through rolls of pennies from his local bank. His focus was usually on older dates and wheat cents, but he checked every coin regardless of age. Near the end of a roll, a 2003 cent caught his attention, not for its date at first, but for its unusually rich color and weighty feel. The luster had a deeper, almost red gold tone, unlike the lighter appearance of typical zinc coins. Patrick's fingers paused, his instincts telling him to look closer. Under a magnifying glass, the details revealed themselves. The date showed faint but unmistakable doubling, most clearly in the 2003, where the numbers carried a shadow-like separation. The letters in Liberty displayed similar split impressions, the kind that experienced collectors recognize as true double die features rather than mechanical doubling. Flipping it over, he noticed the lines of the Lincoln Memorial's columns were minutely misaligned, not enough to create an off-center strike, but enough to look subtly wrong to the trained eye. Patrick placed it on his digital scale. The readout made him lean back in surprise. 3.1 grams. For a moment he thought it might be a fluke, but repeated weighings confirmed it. This was no ordinary copper-plated zinc cent. It was struck on a copper planchet, the kind the mint had not officially used for US cents since 1982. The idea that such a planchet could appear in 2003 was startling. Over 20 years after the transition, there should have been no copper planchets anywhere near the production lines for circulating coins. The possibilities began turning over in his mind. Maybe a stray blank from the early 1980s had been misplaced in storage for decades before being fed into the press. Or perhaps, during a test or special run, a copper planchet meant for another purpose had slipped into the hopper. The double-die obverse meant the coin's story was even more unlikely. A composition error combined with a striking anomaly in a single piece. Patrick kept the coin in a protective flip, reluctant to part with it immediately. For weeks, he studied it under different lighting, compared it to verified transitional errors from earlier years, and reached out discreetly to a few trusted collector friends. The consensus was the same. 2003 copper planchet cents were virtually unheard of, and finding one with a double die was extraordinary. When he finally sent it to a grading service, the process seemed to drag on endlessly. The envelope's return brought the verdict he had been hoping for. 2003 Lincoln cent, double die obverse, struck on 95% copper planchet, mint error. The grade was excellent, with surfaces that showed minimal wear and strong original luster. As the years went on, Patrick followed the market for modern mint errors closely. At first, few collectors paid attention to such late-date transitional errors, assuming they were either impossible or too minor to matter. But that perception began to change as more awareness spread, and occasional high-profile auction results began to surprise even seasoned dealers. Coins like his, with their unusual blend of late-date copper composition and striking irregularities, became recognized as genuine rarities. One detail deepened the mystery even further. In reviewing mint reports from the early 2000s, Patrick found a reference to small batches of copper planchets being prepared for an experimental overseas contract. Officially, none of those planchets were meant to be struck with US dies, yet the proximity of equipment and the speed of operations made it plausible for one to slip into regular production unnoticed. If his coin had come from that scenario, it was not just a leftover blank. It was an unintended survivor of a special minting process never meant for public hands. Today, the coin remains one of Patrick's most prized pieces. He's turned down offers from collectors and dealers who understand exactly how rare such a combination of errors is, especially from such a late year. Experts agree that a 2003 Lincoln cent with both a copper planchet and a double die in such condition commands an exceptional premium. Current market estimates place its value between $40,000 and $110,000, a remarkable sum for a coin that began as just another penny rolling off the presses 2 decades ago.